Imagine your city has already fallen. The walls are breached, the king is gone, and the fires are still burning, yet the worst decision hasn't been made on the battlefield. It's made in the counting lines afterward, when Assyrian officials sort the survivors like inventory, and enemy families realize surrender was only the beginning. Chapter 1. Cold Open. Victory has a second blade. After an Assyrian siege, the battlefield was only the beginning. Palace reliefs and royal inscriptions make the same point again and again. The real work of conquest started when the gates fell. Smoke rise from breached walls, bodies were counted, and survivors were gathered into controlled lines, men, women, and children placed under guard as property of the victorious king. In the Neo-Assyrian period, circa 911 to 609 BCE, this aftermath was not random violence, but an organized imperial system. Campaign records describe cities captured, populations carried off, and spoils counted. The most vivid case is 701 BCE, when King Sennacherib captured Lachish in the Kingdom of Judah. The Lachish reliefs from Nineveh show deportees marching out with belongings piled on carts, prisoners brought before Assyrian officials, and the king receiving the results of the siege as a public spectacle. These images were designed to be seen, proof of control, and a warning to anyone considering resistance. For defeated households, especially the families of enemy soldiers and officials, surrender was not a return to normal life. Assyrian policy routinely broke communities through deportation and resettlement. Skilled workers were selected, groups were relocated across the empire, and local power networks were dismantled. In that process, wives could become captives, forced into relocation, assigned to labor, absorbed into servitude within elite households, or held as political leverage if they belonged to the upper ranks. Assyrian texts are propaganda and must be read critically. Yet even when exaggerated, they reveal a consistent reality. Conquest extended beyond the battlefield, reaching directly into the structure of families, turning defeat into a lasting condition rather than a single moment. Chapter 2. Assyria, the empire built on fear. The Neo-Assyrian Empire did not become the dominant power of the ancient Near East by winning battles alone. From the 9th through the 7th centuries BCE, Assyrian kings built an imperial system that depended on intimidation as much as force. Royal inscriptions were not private diaries, they were political weapons, meant to travel. They were carved into palace walls, stamped onto clay prisms, and read as official memory. Assyrian rulers presented themselves as agents of divine order, claiming the support of the god Ashur and other major deities. In that worldview, rebellion was not merely political, it was a moral offense against the cosmic order the king was expected to enforce. That framing matters because it justified harsh punishments as lawful acts of restoration rather than personal cruelty. The empire also understood reputation as strategy. Assyrian texts repeatedly describe mass deportations, the seizure of tribute, and severe penalties for resistance. Language designed to deter future uprisings before they began. These accounts are propaganda and often exaggerate for effect, but they are consistent across reigns, from Ashur-Nasirpal II in the 9th century BCE to Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal in the 7th. The message was stable: defiance would be answered publicly and decisively. Assyrian palace art supported the same policy. Reliefs show sieges, captives, tribute processions, and the king as the central figure of control. This was statecraft. In stone, an imperial theater meant to shape behavior in distant provinces. For conquered peoples, fear was not an accidental byproduct. It was part of how Assyria governed. Chapter 3. The siege machine, how cities fell. Assyrian conquest was designed to be efficient, repeatable, and overwhelming. By the Neo-Assyrian period, armies moved with a siege toolkit that combined engineering, logistics, and psychological pressure. Reliefs from kings like Sennacherib in Ashurbanipal depict battering rams under protective frames, archers providing covering fire, and soldiers climbing ladders against defended walls. Archaeology and ancient texts support the same picture. Cities were reduced not only by combat, but by planning, cutting supply lines, controlling roads, and forcing defenders into exhaustion. Assyria's success also relied on intelligence and intimidation before the first stone was thrown. Royal annals often list towns that surrendered without a fight after hearing what had happened elsewhere. That was the point. Siege warfare was expensive, so a reputation for certainty, resist and you will be destroyed, was an imperial advantage. When a city finally fell, defeat became a legal and social transformation. In much of the ancient Near East, conquest created a new reality. The victorious king claimed authority over land, people, and property. The Assyrians treated populations as assets to be redistributed. Some were executed or punished as examples, but many were kept alive for labor, tribute, production, and resettlement. This was not mercy, it was management. The fall of a city therefore triggered a second phase of warfare, sorting and processing survivors. Officials counted spoil, identified skilled workers, and separated groups for deportation. For families, this moment was decisive. Once recorded as captives, people could be relocated hundreds of kilometers away, severed from kin networks, and absorbed into imperial projects. Assyrian victory was not simply about taking territory, it was about reorganizing human lives to make future resistance harder. Chapter 4. Captives as currency, deportation, resettlement, and control. One of Assyria's most effective tools was not a weapon, but a policy: large-scale deportation. Across the Neo-Assyrian period, royal inscriptions repeatedly describe conquered populations being carried off and resettled in other parts of the empire. This was not a chaotic byproduct of war. It was an administrative method for breaking resistance and strengthening the state. Deportation served multiple goals at once. Removing people from their homeland weakened local identity and disrupted the social networks that made rebellion possible: clan ties, patronage, sacred sites, and inherited claims to land. At the same time, Assyria used relocated communities to develop underpopulated regions, expand agriculture, and supply labor for royal building projects. The empire's capitals, Kalhu, Nimrud, Dur-Sharrukin, Khorsabad, and Nineveh, were expanded on a vast scale, and such construction demanded workers, craftsmen, and reliable food production. Assyrian practice also shows selectivity. Skilled laborers, metalworkers, scribes, builders, and specialized artisans were especially valuable and often singled out for relocation. Others were organized into agricultural settlements to produce grain and tribute. This meant that captivity did not look the same for everyone. Status mattered. Royal and elite captives could become political hostages, while common people were more likely assigned to labor and resettlement. For families, deportation was a direct assault on continuity. It could mean separation from relatives, loss of language and local custom, and the end of ancestral burial traditions that anchored identity. For women, especially wives of defeated men, captivity often meant displacement into unfamiliar households or work systems, where survival depended on imperial demands rather than community protection. Chapter 5. Enemy wives, the real spoils of war. When Assyrian sources speak of spoil, they do not mean gold alone. People were counted alongside animals, weapons, and tribute, because conquest converted human lives into imperial property. For enemy households, that reality was especially stark. Wives of defeated men could be swept into the same captive columns shown on Assyrian reliefs, displaced from their homes and reassigned within a system that treated captives as labor, leverage, and status symbols. Here the evidence requires precision. Assyrian royal inscriptions rarely describe women's experiences in detail, and palace art tends to show deportation and submission rather than private abuse. But we can responsibly identify the major, documented outcomes that followed defeat across the ancient Near East and within Assyrian imperial practice: forced relocation through deportation, assignment to labor in state projects or agricultural settlements, domestic servitude within Assyrian households, and, for some, incorporation into elite environments through coerced marriage or concubinage, an accepted mechanism of domination in many ancient war contexts. Status determined how this played out. Elite women, wives and relatives of kings, governors, and high Officials could become political hostages. Their captivity carried diplomatic weight, defeated rulers. Family in Assyrian hands could discourage rebellion, secure tribute, or enforce loyalty. Common women, by contrast, were more likely absorbed into labor and household service, where their identity could be reshaped by relocation, renaming, and separation from community protection. This was not a series of isolated atrocities. It was systematic dehumanization through conquest, war turning marriage, family, and social standing into tools of imperial control. Chapter 6. The Palace and the Harem. Power, hostages, and survival for elite captives. The Assyrian palace was not only a residence, it was an institution that managed power. When Assyrian campaigns captured royal families and high-status households, women could be taken into controlled environments tied to the court. In Assyrian records, kings sometimes list captured queens, princesses, and members of ruling families among the most valuable human prizes, because elite women could function as political hostages. Keeping a defeated ruler's family under Assyrian authority reduced the likelihood of renewed resistance and strengthened tribute obligations. Modern audiences often imagine an ancient harem as purely sexual, but in Assyria and neighboring monarchies it also served administrative and political functions. Palace women lived within ranked hierarchies, under supervision, and within a system where access to the king, inheritance, and court alliances were regulated. Evidence from cuneiform archives shows that royal women in Assyria could hold significant economic power, control estates, sponsor religious activity, and manage personnel, while still operating within strict limits set by palace authority and security. For captive women, especially those of elite background, survival depended on navigating that institutional reality. Their fate could include forced relocation into court service, loss of former status, and dependence on new patrons. Inside the palace structure, for some, motherhood could become politically significant because children in royal contexts affected succession, alliances, and legitimacy. For others, captivity meant permanent separation from homeland and kin, even if their material conditions were better than those assigned to labor settlements. What remains consistent is control. The Assyrian Empire. Chapter 7. What the art shows. Connections into instruments of empire. Chapter 7. What the art shows. Reliefs, processions, and the message to the world. Assyrian palace art is one of the clearest windows into how the empire wanted conquest to be understood. From the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, kings filled their palaces with carved stone reliefs showing sieges, battlefield victories, and, most importantly, the controlled aftermath: captives processed, spoils counted, and tribute delivered. These images were not neutral records, they were official messaging, displayed in spaces where foreign envoys, officials, and elites would see them. The Lachish reliefs, created for Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh after his 701 BCE campaign in Judah, are among the best-known examples. They show the mechanics of Assyrian victory in sequence: assault on the city, prisoners escorted under guard, and deportees leaving with possessions. Women and children appear in these processions, reinforcing the idea that entire communities, not only armies, were subject to the king's authority. Yet what these reliefs do not show is as important as what they do. Sexual violence and private abuse are not depicted directly. This absence does not prove such violence never occurred, it shows what Assyrian state art considered useful to display. The goal was to project order, discipline, and inevitability: captives moving in lines, officials recording outcomes, the king receiving submission. Chaos would weaken the message. In other words, the reliefs present conquest as administration, war culminating in organized control over people, land, and labor. That framing helps explain why captivity, especially for families, was treated as a long-term condition, managed visually and politically as part of imperial rule. Chapter 8. Between truth and propaganda, how brutality was sold. Assyrian kings did not write history to inform, they wrote it to govern. Their annals, often preserved on clay prisms and monumental inscriptions, follow a consistent pattern. The king marches, the enemy, rebels, the gods grant victory, and the consequences are described. In language meant to travel, harsh punishments appear not as uncontrolled rage, but as proof that resistance is futile. That is why Assyrian records must be read with skepticism. Royal inscriptions exaggerate numbers, simplify causes, and present every campaign as divinely sanctioned. The purpose was deterrence. A city deciding whether to submit was meant to imagine the worst before its leaders ever tested Assyria's siege engines. But propaganda does not mean fabrication. Historians compare these claims against other evidence, archaeology of destroyed layers at key sites, administrative tablets showing deportees settled in new regions, palace reliefs that visually match the written boast of mass capture, and external sources from neighboring states, including Babylonian chronicles and biblical texts that describe Assyrian invasions and tribute demands. When multiple lines of evidence align, the broad mechanisms, sieges, deportations, hostage-taking, forced labor, become historically secure even if the king's rhetoric is inflated. This raises the uncomfortable question at the center of Assyria's reputation. Does exaggeration make brutality less credible, or more? In Assyria's case, the pattern suggests something sharper. Violence was real, but it was also curated, packaged, and broadcast as policy. The empire ruled by making fear feel rational. Chapter 9. The long aftermath, trauma, assimilation, and erased names. For many captives, the end of a campaign was the beginning of a longer transformation. Resettlement inside the Assyrian system. Deportees were moved across great distances, sometimes from the western Levant to Mesopotamia, or from the Zagros regions into Assyrian heartlands, so that the social foundations of resistance could not easily reform. Administrative records and broader imperial patterns indicate that these communities were then placed into agricultural settlements, labor groups, or urban neighborhoods tied to state needs. Over time, this produced assimilation under pressure. People learned new administrative languages, adopted Assyrian legal norms, and lived under officials who monitored taxes, labor, and movement. Cultural change could be gradual, but captivity accelerated it. Names could shift, local religious practices could weaken without access to traditional temples, and community identity could fracture when elders, elites, or skilled specialists were separated from the rest. For children, this was often decisive. A child deported at a young age might grow up speaking differently, worshipping differently, and thinking of a relocated town, not their parents' homeland, as normal. That did not erase memory, but it changed what memory could do. For wives and mothers, captivity frequently meant holding families together in conditions where kin networks were broken and protections were reduced, while still being subject to imperial demands. This is the part of Assyrian conquest that rarely appears in dramatic images, not the fire, but the administration afterward. The empire's deepest victory was not a ruined wall, it was a reorganized population. Survival could still mean a life permanently cut away from its original identity. Chapter 10. Final reflection, the empire that won, and still feared being forgotten. Assyria's power was real. Between roughly 911 and 609 BCE, it built the largest, most militarized state the Near East had yet seen, with standing armies, provincial administration, and an imperial ideology that tied conquest to divine mandate. But the very intensity of its messaging, those endless reliefs of sieges, captive lines, tribute heaps, and defeated rulers bowing, suggests something else as well. An empire that believed control had to be constantly demonstrated. That is why the aftermath mattered. Assyria did not treat victory as an endpoint. It treated it as a process: punish, deport, resettle, extract labor, and reorganize societies so rebellion became harder to imagine. For defeated families, this system could turn a single military collapse into decades of displacement and enforced dependence. When we ask what happened to the wives of defeated enemies, the most historically defensible answer is not a single sensational claim, it is the structure of conquest itself. Women's fates were shaped by deportation policies, enslavement and labor systems, domestic servitude, and Elite hostage-taking within court institutions. Status altered the details, but not the loss of agency. Assyria eventually fell, its capitals destroyed and its political order replaced. Yet its own art and text survived, ironically, ensuring that the fear it engineered would outlive the empire itself. The dead are counted in inscriptions. The living are harder to measure. They carried the consequences forward. In renamed towns, fractured families, and identities rebuilt under imperial rule. Assyria's legacy is often reduced to a single word: brutal. But the evidence shows something more specific, and more disturbing: a system. Siege warfare was only the opening act. The real mechanism of control followed in deportations, forced labor, hostage-taking, and the reorganization of entire communities, so that defeat did not end when a city surrendered. It continued in where people were sent, what work they were assigned, and how their identities were pressured to change under imperial rule. And when we focus on the wives of defeated enemies, the historical record doesn't give us one neat, sensational scene. It gives us outcomes that are documented across Assyrian practice and wider ancient war patterns. Displacement, loss of legal protection, domestic servitude, and, in elite cases, political captivity inside court systems where family ties became leverage. Different social ranks meant different experiences. But the same core reality: conquest turned people into assets. If you want more real history told with evidence, reliefs, inscriptions, archaeology, and verified chronicles, subscribe to Silent Scholars. If you've made it this far, comment with one word: Nineveh, and tell me which empire you want next: Assyria, Babylon, Persia, or Rome.